thank the Deputy Prime Minister. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. A review by the Closing the Gap Steering Committee has found that this government has effectively abandoned the Closing the Gap strategy. Given this damning indictment, how can the Prime Minister continue to justify $500 million of cuts to Indigenous affairs?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. The government is making substantial progress in Indigenous advancement, and there is much more to be done, and I will set out on Monday in the Closing the Gap statement, the Closing the Gap report, where we are doing satisfactorily and where there is a lot more work to do. But I want to advise the House about the very real advances that have been made. We're making a $5 billion investment over 4 years to 2021 in the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, frontline service funding that will improve the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We're providing an estimated loading of $4.4 billion for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, with students with greater needs attracting higher level of funding due to the implementation of the model that David Gonski designed and we are delivering. And in 2018, this additional funding will benefit over 200,000 Indigenous students. Now, last year I announced a $138 million education package to further enable the economic and social inclusion for which the 67 referendum campaigners fought, and that will include more opportunities for our first Australians to study science, technology, engineering and mathematics. We're empowering communities through our Indigenous procurement policy, with over $500 million in Commonwealth spending going to 956 Indigenous businesses. This is a spectacular increase from just $6.2 million being won by Indigenous businesses in 2012-13 under former policies. We're investing $14 million in empowered communities to provide critical capability for Indigenous leaders as they work with their communities and partner organisations to identify local priorities, needs and aspirations. Our Prison to Work report, commissioned in my 2016 Closing the Gap speech, has since been delivered and released by COAG. From early this year, a voluntary program will provide sentenced Indigenous people in prison with employment assistance to access the support they need on their release. That will prepare them better to find employment and transition back into the community. And of course, last year we appointed June Oscar AO as the first female Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner. Now, Mr Speaker, we've got a lot more to do, but we are getting on with it. We are working with our first Australians. We are doing things with them, not doing things to them.
The member for Barton has the call. Sorry, actually, no. I've jumped ahead already. It's Thursday. It's, the member for Berowra has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government's plan for lower business taxes is driving jobs, investment and economic growth for Australians, including in my electorate of Berowra?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. And the honourable member has thousands of businesses in his electorate, as does every member in this House, which are benefiting from the small and medium company tax cuts that we have already passed through the parliament. Now, this morning, the House passed the next phase of our plan for lower business taxes, but already firms with a turnover of up to $25 million a year are benefiting from a lower company tax, and on 1 July this year, that will be extended to businesses with a turnover of up to $50 million. Collectively, those businesses employ more than half of the Australian workforce and the majority of the private sector workforce. Now, we want all businesses to pay lower taxes on the income they earn, and we want them to do that so they will invest more. Business tax is ultimately a tax on workers. They're the ones who pay for higher taxes through lower wage growth and fewer jobs. And we know the reverse is true. Lower business taxes help to grow wages. They have a real direct impact on Australian families. Backing Australian business, especially small and medium family-owned businesses, is backing Australian workers, and it's ensuring that there are more jobs and better paid jobs. And that we're seeing the evidence of that right now in the Australian economy. 403,000 jobs created last year, the most in our history. And overwhelmingly, the drive, the impetus for this job creation is coming from those small and medium companies that are benefiting from the tax cuts and other incentives that we've provided. And, Mr Speaker, we are seeing a chorus from the business sector reaffirming that they will respond to lower taxes with more investment and more employment, whether it is the small and medium family businesses that all of us know so well in our electorates, or should know. You have the big end of town. Those are companies that are competing for capital globally. They've got global options, and they will respond to invest more in Australia when Australia is more competitive. Now, the Labor Party know that this is right. This is what they said in the 2010 budget. I quoted that yesterday. It's what the Leader of the Opposition used to say a few years ago. It's what Paul Keating has said and done. Everyone recognises that for Australian business to be competitive, there must be a competitive tax regime for business in Australia. We're seeking to set that up, and the result we're already seeing in the small and medium sector is more investment, more jobs and better jobs.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. I now call the member for Barton.
Mr Speaker. Just too quick on my feet, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the government rule out giving up on any of the 7 existing Closing the Gap targets? And why is the government making it harder to achieve Closing the Gap targets, including the target to close the gap in life expectancy within a generation, by cutting $500 million from the Indigenous Affairs budget?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'll ask the Minister for Indigenous Health to add to this answer, but I just want to respond to the question about closing the gap and the targets. What we are engaged on at the moment is a very respectful and extensive consultation with Indigenous communities and leaders, and of course we have a big gathering going on here in Canberra at the moment as part of that, as we seek to frame new Closing the Gap targets that are more extensive and that bring in state and territory governments as well. It is a shared objective. And the honourable member, as a former minister in a state government, knows very well that the responsibility for Indigenous advancement and closing these gaps and other gaps is one that is shared across governments. The proposition that the government is cutting funding for Indigenous affairs is simply wrong. We are putting more resources into Indigenous advancement all the time, and I want to just remind honourable members of what I said a moment ago in my earlier answer, of the signal success of the Indigenous procurement policy. We all understand that economic empowerment is fundamental, and the Commonwealth has shown strong leadership there in that regard, and it has been a success beyond all expectations. We're getting buy-in from state and territory governments and from the corporate sector. But I'll ask the minister to add to the answer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The priorities that have remained as the targets for closing the gap have been consistent. What we have is a 200-year level of disparity, and in 10 years we've set targets that address health, education, and we're extending that to employment opportunities and the way in which we bring forward some of the levels of disparity in a way that we've not been able to achieve to the extent that we had under the 10-year bilateral agreement between both sides of this chamber, that the level of commitment to making a difference doesn't diminish. And certainly within the health sector, we've had some significant gains made, and we will continue to look at how we access mainstream resources that are available to all Australians. And that will include the use of MBS items, PBS, to make sure that the journey just in health alone incorporates other opportunities, but that doesn't diminish from the existing effort nor the commitment to funding, and we will continue to focus on making sure that we close the gap in every facet of lives for Indigenous Australians.
The member for Bennelong.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on the importance for governments to develop and implement sensible and consistent economic policies to drive economic growth and deliver more and better paid jobs for hard-working Australians? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bennelong for his question. Welcome back, the member for Bennelong. Our government, Mr Speaker, has a strong economic plan, for jobs and growth that was endorsed by the Australian people at the last election, where this government was re-elected to get on with implementing that plan. And we are getting results with our jobs and growth plan, as we know, with some 1,100 jobs and more created every single day, Mr Speaker. And you'll be interested to know that more than half of those jobs, I hear it's boring. This is boring. Boring for the member for Lindsay. She'll be interested to know that more than half of those jobs are for women. She'll be interested to know that female participation in the labour force is at its highest level on record, and more than that, Mr
Members
Speaker,
on my right. The
not
member for
only are
Goldstein.
women not left behind by this government, Mr Speaker, but older males aged over 55.
The member for
1 in
Lindsay.
5 of those jobs were going to those men aged over 55, Mr Speaker. The NAB Quarterly Business Survey was out today, Mr Speaker, and that has further evidence with both business conditions, business confidence at below long-term run levels, Mr Speaker. Expected new capital expenditure is at 10-year highs. Expected new employment is at 10-year highs. And that's why we're sticking with this plan. That's why we're sticking, Mr Speaker, with the economic compass that is followed by the Liberals and Nationals on this side of the House that leads us to more jobs and to more growth. That's why we're sticking with our convictions on the economy, Mr Speaker. The only convictions the Labor Party knows are Eddie Obeid, Ian McDonald, Craig Thompson and the Labor thugs, and their convictions, Mr Speaker, that those on that side of the House give life membership to, Mr Speaker. That's the convictions they know about. This mob over here, Mr Speaker, have lost their economic compass. They don't know where they're heading, but there are some who are prepared to admit it. We read in Fairfax today, Labor MPs saying that the leader of the opposition is tilting to the left and the party should be playing up the contrast with the Greens. Well, good luck with that. There is no difference between the Greens and the Labor Party now when it comes to economic policy. Higher taxes, more regulation, higher deficits, uncontrolled spending, anti-trade, anti-mining, anti-jobs. That's the Greens' agenda. That's the Labor agenda, Mr Speaker. You can't pay your workers more if you've got to pay the government more. And that's what the Labor Party did today when they rejected once again a plan that has already demonstrated its worth for companies under 50 million, and the next cab off the rank is companies with 50 to 100 million, and they say no tax cut for you.
The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister today commit to renewing in full the National Partnership on Remote Housing, which expires in June this year? Or is the Prime Minister preparing to give up on this critical part of closing the gap framework?
Members on my right. The Minister for the Environment will cease interjecting. The Minister for Indigenous Health.
remote housing.
The member for Lingiari is now warned.
Can I thank the member for her question? As I indicated yesterday, the focus on remote housing remains a strong feature of the work that we're doing to close the gap. It's resulted in over 400 local Indigenous jobs being created and 92 being apprentices. So it is adding to the growth in both housing and employment opportunities. There's 1,150 new homes, 1,500 refurbishments, and we will continue to build the infrastructure needed in Aboriginal remote communities to ensure that the quality of housing meets the needs that will address the underlying issues and the social determinants that impact on housing, safety, education and the comfort that they can take for granted as being theirs within the community. The reduction in housing—
Member for Griffith is warned.
The reduction in the number of homeless people now in Aboriginal communities is far better than what it was. And this government will leave with a legacy that housing has been a strong feature of our Closing the Gap strategy. The negotiations that we will continue to have with state and territory governments that are important in this are important because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are citizens of each state and territory jurisdiction and must be accorded the same consideration as it would the general population in terms of the housing bilateral agreements that exist between the Commonwealth and the state and territory jurisdiction. They have to be considered in that context because what we tend to do is that we set up separate programs that become the feature and focus of access to infrastructure and housing. This takes this beyond this. This is about Indigenous leaders having raised the issue of the contribution of both Commonwealth and state and territories to their living standards, to their way of life, but to the equality that they seek in every aspect of what they hope to be their journey within our country. We will not reconcile from our commitment to housing in remote communities, and we will continue to plan, develop and implement the programs that are needed to effect that, and that includes creating jobs for young people, as I started with. That is an important economic driver that will give them the wealth and social capital to make a difference to their own lives when not rely on welfare. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The member for Kennedy has the call.
First time I'm in danger of being boring, Mr Speaker. To the Prime Minister, national partnerships on remote housing is already terminating now. Queensland over the 10 years gave $660 million, in Canberra $1,100 million. The LGAQ says 400 jobs and apprenticeships and 1,500 new houses. Occupancy rates are still abysmally around 15 people per house. Rudd Abbott's legacy was 1,500 homes. What do you want to be yours, Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank the honourable member for his question, and of course the subject matter is the same as that asked by the member for Herbert, so I'd refer the honourable member to the minister's answer and just confirm that we are negotiating a new agreement for remote housing with the jurisdictions who remain part of the terminating program. It is very important, as the honourable member knows, as a former minister in Queensland, this is a core state— housing is a core state responsibility, and it is very important that in any new arrangements the states step up to their responsibility. Well, I hope the honourable member's not disagreeing with me, because housing is a core state responsibility. So that renewed agreement is under discussion and negotiation by the minister, ably assisted by the minister who answered the previous question.
The member for Moreton is continually interjecting, as he does most question times. If he interjects again, he'll be out, as will the member for Griffith, who has already been warned. The member for Capricornia.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House how this government's infrastructure investment pipeline is driving record jobs growth across the country, particularly in my electorate of Capricornia? Is he aware of any threats to these job opportunities across Australia?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for a question and note her hard work in making sure that such projects as the Yeppoon flood improvement for the Bruce Highway, the upgrade, which was worth about $170 million, has been completed. And in the floods last year in April, we see that it was well at work with the traffic still flowing. Now that supported about 200 jobs. I remember it very well because back in the Senate estimates on February 11, 2013, I asked in the Senate, is there any money for the construction of the Yeppoon floodplain in the forward estimates? I asked that of a Labor government, and the answer that came back was quite direct: no, there isn't, Senator. So it was the Coalition and Warren Truss who went to work and made sure that that vital upgrade on the Bruce Highway came about. And it is in central Queensland and in the ministers, in the members' electorate, and also the member for Flynn, we've also had other further major investments. Notably amongst them would be the in excess of $190 million that the Commonwealth put towards defence spending there, in addition to the $2 billion that our allies, the Singaporean government, invested in Rockhampton. This shows substantial investment in central Queensland. And there's more work to do, Mr Speaker. The Rocky Ring Road corridor upgrade is $65 million, and we're well underway with that, making sure that that vital piece of infrastructure, which takes the traffic around the airport, is part of the planning for the great city of Rockhampton into the future. Now, of course, we have to have a vision for our nation, and of course the vision for our nation is quite closely attached to the money that our nation can earn. And we see in the revitalisation, the sale of chickpeas in central Queensland, in beef, in cotton, that this is also bringing money into central Queensland and underpinning the economic growth of central Queensland. What would be of great assistance to central and northern Queensland would be the further opening of the Galilee Basin. The Galilee Basin is a vital precinct and helps the wealth of the nation. Today we are talking about closing the gap, and the best way to close the gap is for people to have a job. Now, the member for Lindsay thinks that people having a job is, and I quote, boring. But they don't find it boring in Townsville, where the member for Herbert's from, where youth unemployment is in excess of 20%. They don't find having a job boring at all. They find having a job essential. So we need the Labor Party in the current Batman by-election to stand behind the coal workers of the Galilee Basin, to stand behind the coal miners of central Queensland, to stand up for their core constituency and not announce to workers that their lives are boring. And they do not support the member for Lindsay when she says the prospect of them getting a job is boring. We have to make sure that we get the vital infrastructure so they get a job.
Has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Despite company profits increasing by 20% last year, but average wages for Australians only grown by just 2%, every member of this government voted 5 times to give big business a $65 billion corporate tax cut. Why does every member of the government only ever look after the big end of town and ignore ordinary workers struggling with record low wages growth?
Members on my right. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the government can point to one policy after another that is delivering stronger economic growth and more jobs. We can point to that. And we've seen 403,000 jobs created last year. The Leader of the Opposition said 2017 was going to be about jobs, jobs, jobs. Well, the government delivered on jobs, and we have more to do. But we need to give business the incentive to invest. We need to encourage the private sector that the Leader of the Opposition, in his latest incarnation as a political populist, whatever, Jeremy Corbyn is impersonating at the moment, he now wants to declare a war on business. Well, I'll remind the Leader of the Opposition that there was a time when he knew that cutting tax on businesses created more jobs. He said so, and he and all of his side of politics voted for it again and again because it was common sense and orthodox economics. But let's look at what he's opposing. He opposed the tax cuts for small and medium family businesses that are now creating hundreds of thousands of jobs. He voted against them. He opposed the legislation that funds every school according to need. For the first time, national consistent needs-based funding, as recommended by David Gonski, voted against that. He voted against the childcare reform that will deliver a benefit to 1 million Australian families on lower and lower middle incomes and enable them to stay in the workforce, get that balance of work and family and stay connected to the workforce. That extraordinary reform, rationalising the childcare subsidy system, providing substantial additional money and real equity and availability, was opposed by Labor. He opposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Just think about this. This is a trade deal. This is a trade deal which opens up existing markets we have access to even wider and opens up a whole range of new markets. It will create thousands of jobs, just as the other trade deals Labor opposed. Now, when the United States pulled out, what did the Leader of the Opposition say? He said, "Oh, just throw in the towel, give up." Give up, he said. He wanted to give up on Australian jobs, give up on Australian business, give up on Australian investors. Giving up on Australia is his way, it's not our way. We stuck with it. We stuck with it. We worked hard, and the TPP-11 is happening without the US. We'd rather they were there, but it'll still create thousands of jobs and billions of dollars of opportunity for Australian business.
The member for Parkes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. Will the Minister update the House on the importance of delivering the Murray-Darling Basin Plan on time and in full? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches which threaten the delivery of the plan and the thousands of jobs it supports, including in my electorate of Parkes?
The Minister for Agriculture and Water.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the honourable member for his question, because the honourable member, being from Parkes, knows full well the importance of delivering the plan in full and on time. But what he also understands and fears is that if one part of this plan falls over, then it puts at risk the entire plan. And the reckless actions of the Australian Labor Party and the Greens in supporting a disallowance motion against the Northern Basin Review does that. It puts at jeopardy the risks of the livelihoods of those people in Parkes, the hard-working people in Parkes who are now fatigued and the emotional and physical strain that these actions have put on those people. No Australian should have to go through that, but the Australian Labor Party and the Greens are doing that. This is the Labor Party's plan. This is their review. They had 14 months to come back to us and say if they had problems about the Northern Basin Review, but not once until yesterday did they say they had problems. The reality is they are playing politics above leadership. They are playing with people's lives. And let me tell you, this plan is at real risk of falling over if we vote against the Northern Basin Review. And let me put this in perspective, because we need the states to come on this journey with us. Noel Blair, the New South Wales Water Minister, on ABC Radio on the 7th of the 2nd this year said, "We're really questioning whether we would bother with any of the other implementation of the plan if it's going to be treated like this. The hard work that's been done bringing communities along for the difficult conversations, to then have it just thrown onto the scrap heap like this, I don't know whether we'd want to be in a position to put our communities through that again." But further, and even more importantly, from Lisa Neville, the Australian Labor Party Water Minister, media release on the 2nd of February 2018, the decision to disallow the Northern Basin Amendment by the Greens and the Federal Labor Party raises serious concerns about the future of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. We will be assessing our position on the plan as a result of this decision, and we will have further discussions with New South Wales. The Senate has created huge uncertainty about whether the plan can be delivered. There you have it. There is the proof. We are playing with the future of the plan right here, right now. This takes leadership, and if it falls over, it will hang around the neck of the Australian Labor Party and the Greens for generations to come.
The member for Bruce is now warned. The member for McMahon has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Every member of this government today voted 5 times to give big business a $65 billion tax cut. Why is the Prime Minister increasing taxes on millions of working Australians by $300 every year to pay for his $65 billion big business tax cut?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, this from the honourable member, who was one of the more eloquent and indeed extensive advocates for cutting company tax. He actually wrote a book about it. He wasn't content with some well-chosen words at the dispatch box. No, he went out and wrote a whole book about the need for following in the footsteps of his mentor Paul Keating and cutting company tax precisely for the purpose of being competitive with the rest of the world. He thought we were uncompetitive a few years back when he wrote the book. How does he think we are now when the US has got a company tax rate of 21% and we're sitting, for larger companies, at 30%? And our reform plan is heading to 25, but still the US is at 21. Now, does he seriously think that Australian jobs will be protected with such an uncompetitive tax rate? The member for McMahon who wrote that book knows we are not competitive at that rate. But now, of course, he's changed his spots and he wants to purport to be or impersonate some kind of job-destroying, business-hating populist. Let's get back to some of the other things the Labor Party is doing to undermine jobs. Not only are they opposing business tax cuts, not only are they threatening to increase the tax on the very companies that have employed most of the 403,000 people who got new jobs, additional jobs last year. Not only do they want to do that, not only are they opposing the childcare reforms, opposing the school reforms, they opposed every step of the way our energy measures, which are putting downward pressure on energy prices. They ridiculed the efforts with the retailers, which are saving families hundreds of dollars right now. They ridiculed our efforts with the gas companies that have brought down the wholesale price of gas, saving thousands of jobs in energy-intensive industries, and, of course, again, putting downward pressure on energy prices. They opposed the National Energy Guarantee, which has received support from across industry and which we know from independent modelling will reduce wholesale energy costs by 23%. So there is not one policy that the Labor Party has which will encourage one business to invest $1 or employ one worker. And when we make that challenge to them, they cannot volunteer one. They do not have one business-supporting, investment-creating, job-creating policy. Every job, every business is at grave risk if the Labor Party were to occupy the benches on this side of the House.
The member for Forrest.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the minister update the House on the real benefits that Australian workers and businesses are seeing from the Coalition's free trade agreement achievements? Are there any alternative approaches that would jeopardise economic growth and the creation of jobs for hard-working Australians?
The Minister for Trade and Investment.
I thank the member for Forrest for a question, and as we've outlined over the past several days, another passionate believer in the trade export opportunities that this government is opening up for Australian small and medium-sized businesses, and in particular, of course, our agri-businesses. We continue to see the jobs benefits, the jobs bonanza, frankly, that flows from opening up trade export opportunities. And the member for Forrest's own electorate, we've seen under the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement and we know that the member for Forrest has one of the best wine regions in the country, not the only one, but one of the best, and she'll know under CHAFTA that we've seen wine exports to China have grown by 129.5% since the coalition brought the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement into place, nearly $500 million worth of wine exports. The member for Forrest asks about alternative approaches, and I've got to say, Mr Speaker, there are some alternative approaches. I was thumbing my way through my favourite broadsheet, The Australian, the other day, some great columnists in The Australian. One of my favourite columnists, Mr Speaker, is I think I'm on solid territory when I say a man who embodies the best Labor virtues, Graham Richardson. And Graham Richardson, in a very interesting article on Australia Day, he said, titled "Unpopular Tack on Trade Pact Could Doom Bill Shorten's Leadership." And he said the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal brought one of Labor's biggest difficulties into sharper focus. Every time a new deal is approved, the unions immediately oppose it. It gives good insight into Labor thinking on all of this. To follow the unions from which Labor descended and which bankroll Labor's election campaign is almost an automatic reaction. He was talking about my shadow minister, and he said, "I can't blame Jason Clare. Labor was caught by surprise with its pants no further up than its ankles." So it starts to give some insight into Labor thinking on the TPP. But what's interesting is where Labor's going to go. And he said, Labor will still have to outline a detailed response. You can filibuster and obfuscate for a while, but eventually Shorten will have to say yes or no. If he says yes, the trade unions will react angrily. So we know that this puppet on a string is waiting to get his marching orders from the Australian Labor Party, and that's why we see from the CFMEU, who make ridiculous claims, and this is what they said about CHAFTA, boosted wine exports by 129%. The CFMEU said CHAFTA is the worst trade agreement that an Australian government has ever signed and attempted to impose on the Australian public. Now, I smell a rat. I think he's being set up, because I don't think this was just Graham Richardson. I think the member for Grainler was involved as well, because it finishes, he might have scraped through if he was regarded merely as untrustworthy, being tricky as well as weak, could well put the political death of the Labor leader.
The member for Cunningham.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, every member of this government, including the member for Gilmore, voted 5 times to give big business a $65 billion handout today. And if the government has its way, a single-income family living in Nowra—
The member for Cunningham will resume her seat. Members on my right will cease interjecting, including, as always, the Leader of the House and the member for Deakin and others. I can't hear the question. The member for Cunningham can begin again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, every member of the government, including the member for Gilmore, voted 5 times to give big business a $65 billion handout today. If the government has its way, a single-income family living in Nowra earning $60,000 will pay an extra $300 in tax every year. Why is the Prime Minister hurting families in Nowra and my community to pay for his $65 billion handout to big business?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for a question. And the honourable member, no doubt, has many families in her electorate who are clients of the NDIS and look forward to having services paid for through the NDIS. And no doubt those very people would be concerned that the NDIS is actually paid for, because they'll want certainty. And when they say to the honourable member, how can we be sure it's paid for, if she told the truth, she'd have to say, Labor has no plan to do so. Labor has no plan to do so. Labor announced the policy, secured the agreement of the coalition, then in opposition, for an increase in the Medicare levy, which we supported and which was widely supported in the community, and then failed to deliver the funding to pay for the rest of the NDIS. So it's the Labor Party's shame and failure that we're addressing at the moment with the measure that she speaks of in the Senate. The real question is this: is the Labor Party prepared to look into the eyes of a parent with a disabled child and say to them, we can't guarantee the funding for your NDIS because Labor can't. Labor has no plan and no
Members
money.
on both sides.
And what they are voting against
Member for
now
Sydney.
is the certainty and the compassion that
Member for
those
Sydney's
families
now
deserve.
The member for Boothby has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Jobs and Innovation. Will the minister update the House on action the coalition government is taking to generate more and better paid jobs for hard-working Australians? How does this compare to alternative approaches which fail to stimulate jobs and growth?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Boothby for her question. Mr Speaker, this week the government's been absolutely getting on with the job of focusing, as a good government should, on the creation of jobs, stimulating investment, growing the economy, and we are getting the necessary measures passed through both houses of the parliament to do so. This week we passed the Regional Investment Corporation Bill through both houses of the parliament. Today we passed the second tranche of the corporate tax changes through the House of Representatives, the balance of the reforms that we passed last year, which will now go to the Senate. We also passed the Banking Executives Accountability Regime Bill to ensure that banking executives are properly remunerated. In a social area, of course, that still impacts very much on the lives of Australians, we continued the pilot of the cashless debit card. This government is focused on the things that the Australian public care about, and the first one of those is having a job. We've created 403,000 new jobs in the last 12 months, Mr Speaker, a record number. And this week we announced more jobs in defence industry, in regional Victoria and regional New South Wales. We announced more jobs in the parks with the collection of the first links for the Inland Rail project, one of the great nation-building projects of Australia's history, promoted by the Deputy Prime Minister, along with defence industry, making huge changes to the economies of regional Australia. These are issues that we regard as critically important to a good government, that the member for Lindsay regards as boring, Mr Speaker. Doesn't it really sum up where the Labor Party has sunk to? That what Hawke and Keating used to describe as the most important responsibility of a Labor government, providing jobs for working people, the member for Lindsay now describes as boring, Mr Speaker. Well, she's only following the example of her leader, though, Mr Speaker, because he is making the transition for Labor from the party of Hawke and Keating, that knew that they had to have economic credibility after the Whitlam fiasco, to the party of Gavar and Chavez yet again, Mr Speaker. That is where the Labor Party leader is taking you, to win a by-election, to defeat the Greens in Batman, Mr Speaker, which he still may not win. A safe Labor seat. Batman is a safe Labor seat. And to hang on to it, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is taking you to the party of Chavez and Gavar rather than the party of Hawke and Keating, Mr Speaker. How sad. How sad for Paul Keating and Bob Hawke, who transformed the Labor Party, for the Leader of the Opposition to drag you back to the far left of Australian politics, where you began, and the Australian people won't vote
has
for you.
concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Given that the strong endorsement that the Prime Minister has given to his corporate tax cuts, will he commit right now to taking his $65 billion of big corporate business handouts to the next election?
Member for Corangamite is warned. Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. We're looking forward to our enterprise tax cuts being passed in the Senate in this parliament. And The Labor Party has opposed them. They opposed the tax cuts that were passed in the Senate previously, and they are tax cuts that are operating now. Mr. Speaker, right now, in the honourable member's electorate of Maribyrnong, there are 15,937 businesses that are benefiting from the tax cuts that have already been passed. And what the owners of those businesses want to know, most of them very small businesses, most of them overwhelmingly family-owned businesses, they want to know why their own member leads a party that wants to take those tax cuts away, that wants them to pay more tax, because they're starting to see some green shoots in the economy. They're starting to see jobs growth. They're starting to see the better times that the Treasurer promised at the last budget. They're starting to see them, and they want to know.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order. Leader of the House will cease interjecting. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order will state the point of order.
On direct relevance, it was a very specific question. Will he take his tax cuts to the next election, yes or no?
And I'm just going to say on that point of order, it had a number of aspects to it. That was one part of the question. The Prime Minister is completely relevant in his answer. He stayed completely on the topic of the tax cuts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are looking forward to our tax cuts being passed in this parliament, and yes, we will go to the next election with the benefit of those tax cuts flowing through into the economy in thousands more jobs. And the real question is where we have the ambiguity from the Labor Party. The ambiguity from the Labor Party is what they will do about the thousands of small businesses. We stand for competitive company tax in Australia, as Labor used to, and we remain committed to that because we want Australian workers to get the benefit from the investment that only a competitive tax rate can deliver. And so the honourable member wants to fight us on tax cuts for business and fight us in jobs. We'll fight him here, and we'll fight him at the next election on a platform that supports Australian business, Australian investment, Australian exports and Australian jobs, the jobs that he has abandoned.
The member for Bowman.
Thanks, Speaker. A question to the Minister for Health. Will the minister update the House on the action the coalition government is taking to support the health of all Australians, including my Redland City constituents in the seat of Bowman? And is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Bowman, who even to this day is offering pro bono eye clinics to his constituents and others in the South Brisbane area. And he would know that over the course of the last year, we've been able to contribute to the health of Australians by bringing on board new drugs such as Opdivo for lung cancer, Entresto for chronic heart failure, guaranteeing Medicare and, in addition to that, delivering the highest bulk billing rates on record. In particular, this year we've already been able to start with a $110 million package for youth mental health, 19 new breakthrough research programs for rare cancers and rare diseases such as glioblastomas and other forms of brain cancer. And so we've been able to make huge strides, including the agreements we've had with the RACGP and the AMA, with Medicines Australia and with the Pharmacy Guild, but also the reforms of private health, which have delivered the lowest changes in 17 years, lower than any year under Labor. Now, he also asks, are there alternatives? Yes, there are alternatives to an approach of genuine reform and genuine delivery. And the alternative on that side of the chamber is a very simple proposition, and that is Labor hates private health insurance, and Labor is willing to damage and destroy the public health system to carry out their ideology. What we saw on Sunday was a con job where Labor attempted to pretend finally that they were a friend of private health. The reality is very different. They have a proposal to strip away the lowest cost private health policies. That would lead to a 16% increase in private health. In addition to that, they would strip away the rebate. They would slash the rebate for pensioners, seniors and lower-income Australians. And what has been the response to this policy? Well, the first thing is, only yesterday, the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority responded by saying APRA does not consider industry profits or capital levels to be the primary driver of rising premiums for private health. They go on to talk about the need for genuine reform. And interestingly, what do they conclude? It is very much in the community's interests that the current reform process continues. But then other people have gone far further. The Queensland Teachers Union Health Fund, you would imagine they might support the Labor proposals, have said in response to the opposition's announcement, insurers might reduce benefits for certain procedures or restrict them. The Members' Health Alliance, what have they said? They represent 23 not-for-profits. They've described Labor's policy as damaging competition, destroying jobs in small and regional communities and leaving consumers without health cover.
The
in other
minister's
words,
time has
higher
concluded.
prices, lower services, disastrous policy.
The member for Jagga has the
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. When will the government lower deeming rates for part pensioners?
The Minister for Social Services has the call. Members on my left.
I'd like to thank the member for her question, thank the Speaker for the call. We will consider all options that will help. We will consider all options that will help Australians get a job. There are 1,100 Australians who—
Members on my
there
left.
are 1,100 Australians who are getting a job each day. They're getting a job each day. And you know what that does? That means that we get a stronger economy. And you know what happens when you get a stronger economy? It means that you can look after people. That means that when it comes to pensioners, you can make sure that you can deliver them the income that they need. When it comes to those who are unemployed, it means that you can deliver for them. It means when you are in government, you do not have to move 80,000 people off the single parent payment to Newstart. So we will continue to grow our economy, continue to deliver 1,100 jobs a day, because that's the best way we look after our pensioners. That's the best way we look after the unemployed. That's the best way we deliver.
Minister will resume his seat. Members on both sides. Has the minister concluded his answer? The minister's concluded his answer. Members on both sides will cease interjecting. The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on the importance of a strong and consistent approach to the national security agenda, and how does this compare to alternative approaches?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I want to thank the member for Robertson for her question. It's a pity when she was asking the question, the Leader of the Opposition said, "Oh dear, let's talk about this," and he turned around with a piece of paper which I think is blank and is pretending now to have a conversation with the Shadow Treasurer and the member for Sydney, because I suspect he doesn't want to hear about this particular topic, Mr Speaker, because the Australian public now understand that the Leader of the Opposition says one thing in one part of the country to an audience because he thinks that's what they want to hear, but when he jumps on the plane he feels that he's cleansed himself and he travels north, normally to Queensland, where he says the complete opposite of that which he's just said in the south of the country. I mean, it's hard to keep up with the positions of the Leader of the Opposition, and the Australian public get that this guy is duplicitous at best, Mr Speaker. He has double-crossed every colleague he's ever shaken hands with. He has worked for and against union bosses. You don't become the chief union boss of this country without skeletons in the closet, Mr Speaker, and this fellow has plenty of them. And, Mr Speaker, when it comes to border protection, we know that the Leader of the Opposition is down in Victoria, in the inner-city seat of Batman, where there's a by-election and where the Labor Party fears that the Greens will win that seat from the Labor Party. He's telling them that the Labor Party will go soft on border protection. He's saying that they'll bring people here from offshore detention centres, that they won't be turning back boats where it's safe to do so. They will abandon the policy which has stopped people drowning at sea. But you can imagine why it confuses people in seats like Longman and Petrie and Dixon and Brisbane in the state of Queensland, because there are many people, not just in Queensland but across the country, who support wholeheartedly the work that we're doing in keeping our borders safe. And, Mr Speaker, if you can't keep your borders secure, you cannot provide for a safe community. In addition to that, Mr Speaker, over the course of the last period, we've cancelled 3,300 visas of non-citizens who have committed criminal offences against Australian citizens, including 170 visas of outlaw motorcycle gang members. We have cancelled more visas of criminals in the last 12 months than Labor cancelled through their entire 2 terms in government. So, Mr Speaker, if you're sitting in Longman or you're sitting elsewhere in marginal seats around the country and you're confused by this Leader of the Opposition, fair enough. But know this, if you wonder what is the difference between the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, know that the Labor Party is always soft when it comes to border protection, and they are soft on law and order. They demonstrate it every day in their opposition to the plans that we've implemented successfully, and we will keep Australians safe.
The Minister resumed his seat. Member for Isaacs is very loud. Not only disturbs me listening to the answer, he disturbs those around him. The member for Werriwa.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Urban Infrastructure. Will the government ensure that on the day of its opening, rail access will be available at Western Sydney Airport along the north-south corridor, opening up jobs, economic opportunities from the north-west to the Macarthur region?
The Minister for Urban Infrastructure.
Well, I do thank the member for Werriwa for her question, and I'd like to thank her for her work on the Forum on Western Sydney Airport, which is the community consultation mechanism we have underway to make sure that there is good community engagement in relation to Western Sydney Airport, a project which it took the coalition government to get underway, a project which had been in the too hard basket for 20, 30, 40 years, and it took a coalition government to take a decision to proceed with Western Sydney Airport, and we have made the commitment to invest $5.3 billion of taxpayers' funds to get this airport built and delivered by the end of 2026. Already there is work underway on the site with a high-voltage transmission line being undergrounded. That is a project of nearly $100 million. Already we have the head office of the company open and operational in the members' electorate in Liverpool, in the electorate of Werriwa. And of course, we have a $3.6 billion Western Sydney infrastructure plan involving the provision of excellent ground transport connectivity to Western Sydney Airport, including a new M12 that will run from the airport to the M7 and connect into the Sydney motorway network. And of course, the Northern Road will be upgraded to at least 4 lanes, all of its 35-kilometre length. At the same time, the two governments, the Commonwealth Government and the New South Wales Government, have worked well advanced on a scoping study to look at the rail needs of Western Sydney and Western Sydney Airport. That is reported to the two governments, and we'll have more to say in coming months. The airport, of course, on-site is being planned to be rail-ready, and that work is well underway. The Turnbull government is getting on with delivering—
The Minister will resume his seat. The member for Grayndler on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. It was a very precise, tight question, Mr Speaker, and it asked would the rail line be open when the airport is open.
Member for Grayndler can resume his seat. He doesn't need to disclose to me he was the author of it. It's not necessary at all. The minister is being directly relevant to the question.
I do thank the Shadow Minister who never delivered Western Sydney Airport for that interjection. I do thank the Shadow Minister who was also responsible during that glorious period of Albonia. He was briefly responsible for the NBN as well. But I do thank the Shadow Minister, but more importantly I thank the member for her question. I do thank and acknowledge the bipartisan support for Western Sydney Airport and the extraordinary transformations that are going on in Western Sydney infrastructure. Of course, we have worked well advanced between the Commonwealth and the New South Wales governments in relation to a Western Sydney City deal. We have an overall comprehensive policy approach to delivering infrastructure for Western Sydney, as we are doing around the country. The Turnbull government delivering infrastructure for Western Sydney. We've got a track record that we're proud of, and there's a lot more going on.
The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. Will the minister inform the House on the action the government is taking to assist welfare recipients with drug, alcohol and gambling addictions? And is the minister aware of any evidence to support the expansion of those programs, particularly in my electorate of Grey?
The Minister for Social Services.
I'd like to thank the member for Grey for his question, and can I please acknowledge his commitment, especially to regional, rural and remote Australia. It is heartfelt, it is passionate, and he is a terrific advocate for his electorate. The member for Grey has seen how the cashless debit card has benefited Ceduna in his electorate. The cashless debit card is a world first in the way welfare payments are delivered. It is a new program with a new approach for old problems. As the Prime Minister has said about this program, it is about compassion. It is about making sure the money for vulnerable people through welfare payments helps them as best it can. I know the member for Grey has had close contact with the community throughout the trial period, visiting Ceduna on many occasions. He was involved in the initial presentation to the communities and has been pleased with the reception it has received. Ceduna Mayor Alan Suter has said of the cashless welfare card, and I quote, "There are irrefutably excellent results. For example, 40% of people on the trial indicated they are smoking or drinking or drugging or gambling less, and most of the results are on those lines." This is a quote. It was particularly encouraging. It has improved people's lives and improved the situation for children. It is the best initiative I have seen in this field, and it has made our community safer, particularly for families and drinkers. We are trying new programs and policies because we want to find a solution. While the government, and I'd like the opposition to hear this, while the government appreciates the support provided by the opposition, while we appreciate your support in voting down the disallowance motion today in the Senate, we would like your support for continuing this program and rolling it out to new sites. We would like your support not only for the 2 existing trials, but for rolling it out to new sites, because we know it delivers, and even former Labor Party members say that it delivers. And that is why we want you to support us. This is important for Ceduna. It's important for East Kimberley, but it's also important for the goldfields. It's also important for Hervey Bay. And we would like you to come along this journey with us rather than trying to wreck it.
Members on both sides. The member for Jagga.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that the minister table the document that he read word for word from.
Members on both sides. Was the minister reading from confidential notes? Why don't you stop interjecting, and why doesn't someone jump? The member for Braddon.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. According to the AMA's public hospital report card, since this Conservative government came to office, the average wait time for elective surgery in Tasmania has increased by 60% to 72 days. Why should patients in Tasmania needing hip replacements have to wait even longer for surgery because of this Prime Minister's cuts to hospitals?
The Minister for Health.
Thanks.
Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member and make a very clear point. Labor don't just hate private health, they're medi-frauds as well. And there's a reason, and that is because under us what you have seen is record hospital funding every year in every state and every territory. Let me repeat, record hospital funding every year in every state, in every territory. And if you want to understand about Tasmania, when we came to office, the figure that was given under the previous Labor government at the federal level was $299 million in 2013, then to $330 under us, to $375 under us, to $387, $393, $408, $423 million, and going up and up each and every year. That is what is actually happening. Record funding under us, and each year is a record year. An interesting thing, though, is since we have come in, our funding to state hospitals has increased by 34%. How much has state funding increased to state hospitals? 10%. So we have increased funding at more than three times the rates of the states. Our funding is up $103 billion over the current 5-year period. It's at $103 billion. Under Labor federally, in the entire 6 years that they were in government, it was $73 billion. But if you say, gosh, gee, it's a little bit later in time, what is the growth rate? And I'll tell you, under Labor it was 6%, under us it's 7.9%. In other words, our growth rate is 1.9% higher than under the previous Labor government. So these people are not just haters of private health insurance, they're medi-frauds. And you know what? There was a particular document that fell into my hands. It happened to be from the Shadow Minister for Health and Medicare. It was after a meeting. I will table it, with the participation, as she says, of over 150 leading thinkers on health. Sounds a bit like the Citizens' Assembly, coincidentally exactly the same numbers. They then produced their document on their health policy. And
the member for Ballarat
with 17 pages.
No, the member for Ballarat will cease interjecting.
How much money did they commit for hospital funding? $0. They didn't contribute, they didn't propose, they didn't budget for an extra single dollar for hospital funding. Not one extra dollar. And yesterday, the member for Ballarat was asked about this, and in one of those disastrous press conferences was utterly unable to commit a single extra dollar. So we've delivered $103 billion. The states, the previous government delivered $73 billion and triple the rate of growth of the states. We're making it.
The member for Swan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. Will the Attorney-General update the House on action the government is taking to implement the recommendations of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sex abuse? How will this action help recognise the harm suffered by survivors and ensure these heinous crimes never happen again?
The Attorney-General.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Swan for his question and, of course, for his advocacy over many long years on behalf of survivors. And I would just say to him, as my friend, that there's nothing as powerful as advocacy that's anchored in someone's own endured experiences of some of the cruelties that were hidden under the roofs of these institutions. Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister this morning announced his commitment to a national apology for survivors of institutional child sex abuse. This event will be a significant national milestone. It will also be a critical healing event for survivors themselves. The apology will be developed with a group of survivor representatives and representatives of the government, the opposition, the Australian Greens and a member of the crossbench. So we are very much wanting this to be a truly bipartisan event and apology. The breadth and the scope of the Royal Commission report is enormous, and if I can just, in that spirit of bipartisanship, offer some indication as to how we are progressing with those recommendations. There are 409 in total, 189 new recommendations, and of those new recommendations, 67 are directed at the Commonwealth. We've established and provided for a task force inside my department which will coordinate the implementation and the responses from state and territories towards a consistent national response. It will report regularly and transparently via a website for all Australians to track our performance in this area. Part of that, and critical, is the redress scheme. That itself addresses 84 of those 409 recommendations, so it is utterly critical. We, of course, with the help of members opposite, have introduced the legislation. The terms of the legislation are known. The scheme that we have put into this House is due to start on 1 July. It is funded. We have been utterly and completely transparent with the states, the territories, the churches and the charities. And having led that negotiation process over the last 9 months, if I can take this opportunity to say that the horrific circumstances that came to be, that we are now dealing with, came to be because of excuses. Excusing the monstrous conduct of individuals, excusing the failures and outrageous willful blindness of the institutions. What we cannot accept now, at the critical point of creating a national redress scheme, is to accept any more excuses. Excuses for failing to join the scheme must end. Lingering reasons for delay are now starting to look for any independent observer as if minor details are being manifestly and deliberately used as excuses for needless delay. Excuses are what created this problem, and they should not prevent the churches, the charities, the states and the territories from joining the redress scheme.
The Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
On indulgence, if I can briefly associate the opposition with the remarks of the Attorney-General, we think it is very well said. No more excuses, no more delays. Certainly the opposition will work with the government.
It's okay, I can see you. The member for Gorton.
This is third time lucky this week. Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Workplace. Fair Work Australia terminated a work choices agreement struck by Laundry Exhibition Propriety Limited because it left workers worse off in relation to penalty rates, leave and overtime. The Minister was a director of the company when this unfair work choices agreement was struck. Given the Minister's previous support for work choices, does he plan on reintroducing any elements of that unfair legislation, or is he content to continue the government's cuts to penalty rates?
The Minister for the Workplace has the call.
I thank the honourable member for his newfound interest in small and family business. I would expect that's the first question he's ever asked about one his entire life. And it's nice to be asked a question given his strong association and history with small and family business. I don't know how many people he's actually employed, put his hand in his pocket and paid in his time. I imagine the answer is not many, if at all. The agreement and the premise of his question is fundamentally flawed. I take interest. I thank him for his interest in my father's business. If he has questions that he wants to ask my father, feel free at any time. There are others on the front bench that get on very well with him. He's more closely aligned with your side of politics than he is of ours. At the time of the agreement, that is mentioned, it was let loose because it was finished and terminated, not for the reasons that he states. It was let loose because the hotel was taken over by Woolworths, and they can't have, because of the size and the cross-borders that they operate in, inconsistent workplace agreements. They like everything to be consistent. That said, in the 23 years that I had working for my family's business, I have seen many times the impact that raising wages has on businesses. 1.1 million small and family businesses last year made not $1 in profit. Not $1 in profit. Yet they employed people paying salaries amounting to $39.5 billion. $39.5 billion. Yet those opposite want to sully the reputation of those people. The member for Fenner yelling out, they dodged their tax. They didn't make a profit. They put their hand in their own pocket and employed people, day in and day out. That is the truth. That is the truth of what small and family business operators go through in this country. What happens if the member opposite and the minister, the opposition leader, along with Sally McManus in McManustan, there it is, Tim, McManustan, they increased the minimum wage by 28%. Those 1.1 million businesses, that $39.5 billion in wages, if you take at the average wage, around 570,000 employees would most likely immediately lose their job. These are the nut job policies that those opposite. The agenda has been hijacked by the union movement. They have lurched so far to the left, the Leader of the Opposition and my opponent have made that many left-hand turns they've completed a circle. The truth is that the small and family business operators in this country deserve the respect, and they have it on this side of the parliament.
The member for Barker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for the Environment and Energy, representing the Minister for Education and Training. Will the Minister update the House on how many families across the country will benefit from the Coalition Government's new childcare package, including, Minister, those in my electorate of Barker? And if you could, Minister, could you compare it to alternative approaches?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy, representing the Minister for Education.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Barker for his question and know that he is fighting hard for his constituents from Mount Gambier to Murray Bridge, Mr Speaker, and more than 80% of those families with using childcare in his electorate will benefit from the Turnbull government's reforms. Indeed, they are the most significant reforms in 40 years, Mr Speaker. An additional $2.5 billion has been added to childcare, and around 1 million families are benefiting. And our emphasis is on the lower and middle-income families and those where parents are working, studying, volunteering, Mr Speaker. They're the ones who will benefit out of our childcare reforms. And we are delivering a fairer system, because there are 370,000 Australian families using childcare with an income less than $65,000. And they will see their subsidy go up from 72 to 85%, Mr Speaker. And we're delivering a more accessible system, because 85% of families using childcare have an income less than $185,000, Mr Speaker. And we are abolishing the annual cap on the rebate, Mr Speaker. And we will deliver a more affordable system as well by introducing an hourly rate cap, Mr Speaker, which will deliver lower prices compared to the Labor Party when they were last in office, where childcare prices went up by more than 50%, Mr Speaker. So a family in Australia with an income of $80,000, with 2 children under 6 years of age, in childcare 5 days a week, paying $100 a day, under the Turnbull government's reforms, they will be $8,000 a year better off, Mr Speaker. $8,000 a year better off. Now, what do you think the Labor Party did, Mr Speaker? Do you think they voted for that legislation, for that reform, Mr Speaker? No. The Labor Party voted against it, despite the fact that 71% of families using childcare in the member for McMahon's electorate would be better off, despite the fact that 72%
of families in the member for Maribyrnong's electorate will be better off, Mr Speaker, despite the fact that 75% of families in the member for Port Adelaide's electorate will be better off, and despite the fact that in the member for Kingston, the shadow minister responsible in this area, 83% of the families in her electorate will be better off for the Turnbull government's reform. So, Mr Speaker, when it comes to childcare, as it comes to education, like when it comes to company tax, like it comes to free trade, like when it comes to energy, Mr Speaker, don't look at what Labor says, look at what Labor does. And only the Coalition can deliver a more affordable and reliable childcare system for all Australian families.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.